I never thought a single cassette tape, recorded in a hospital room and labeled with nothing but a date scrawled in blue ballpoint, would obliterate my brother's $280,000 scheme and leave him polishing album shelving in a shirt that says scratched lies on the back. But that is exactly what happened, and this is how I shivved his perfect life with a $10 Walkman, a dead man's voice, and a shredder I fixed myself. I was 52 years old when my father died, a former cataloging librarian who had walked away from a tenure-track university position 15 years earlier to care for him full-time after my mother's sudden aneurysm. The only sibling was my older brother Martin, the kind of man who had coasted through life on a smile and a handshake, a commercial real estate broker who always arrived 15 minutes late to family dinners with a bottle of wine he claimed cost $300, but actually came from a grocery store clearance bin. His wife Diane was a high-end residential agent, a woman who judged furniture by its Instagram potential and treated compassion like a social media filter you could toggle on and off between listing photos. My father was a retired structural engineer, a quiet man who built hospitals and bridges, but the only architecture that ever betrayed him was the trust he placed in his own son. That one sentence covers the entire backstory I am willing to give, because the timeline of my life before the discovery does not matter, only what I did after. Dad passed on a Thursday afternoon in early March, his lungs finally surrendering after a decade of emphysema. I held his hand in the hospice wing of St. Luke's and listened to the last rasp catch in his throat, while Miles Davis's Kind of Blue played softly from a portable speaker I had brought from home. That detail Miles Davis will pay off later. I promise. Within 18 hours, Martin and Diane had swept into Dad's modest mid-century ranch house, like federal agents executing a seizure warrant. Diane wore a cream-colored pantsuit and clutched a leather portfolio containing a checklist of items she had prepared weeks in advance, her heels clicking across the hardwood floors with a rhythm that sounded like a stopwatch counting down. Martin stood in the kitchen, already on the phone with a probate attorney he refused to name, and told me in the soothing voice of a man practicing a eulogy that he would take everything from here, that I should rest, that grief made people do irrational things like contesting an executor who had only my best interests at heart. I watched Diane run her finger along the top of a bookshelf and then inspect the dust on her fingertip as if the house itself had failed a cleanliness inspection. She said, "We'll have a crew in by Monday. Don't worry about a thing, Lily. You've done enough for one lifetime." The word enough dripped with condescension. I spent the morning of the second day in a fog, walking from room to room while they inventoried Dad's possessions with barcode scanners and color-coded sticky notes. They tagged the furniture with neon orange for estate sale stickers, circled the china cabinet with a pink post-it that said eBay LOT4, and argued about whether a 1970s teak credenza was Danish or just Danish style. The house smelled of lemon pledge and entitlement. Around noon I wandered into Dad's small study, a room I had kept dusted but otherwise untouched during his final months because he hated anyone rearranging his engineering journals. The study had a single window that looked out onto a dying crabapple tree, and the shelves were lined with textbooks on structural dynamics, soil mechanics, and the complete essay journals from 1965 to 2005. Tucked behind a row of those journals on the bottom shelf, in a gap you would only see if you crouched down and looked sideways, I noticed a wooden cigar box I had never seen before. The box was plain pine, about 8 inches long and 5 inches wide, with a bent brass latch and a faint residue of old adhesive where a label had once been. I pulled it out just as Martin appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the hallway light, his tie loosened. He saw the box in my hands, laughed a short bark of a laugh, and asked if I was hoping to find buried treasure. He took it from me without asking, flipped the lid with his thumb, and peered inside with the practiced disinterest of a man who had already appraised the estate down to the copper piping. "Old cassette tapes," he announced, tilting the box so I could see the jumble of plastic inside. Maybe 6 or 7 of them, plus a little spiral-bound pocket notebook with a cracked cover. Worthless junk, Lily. Dad's audio diaries or whatever, probably recordings of him reading concrete pour specifications. He dropped the box into a black contractor bag full of what Diane called unsalvageable clutter, tied the neck with a sharp pull, and told me the estate cleanup crew would haul everything to the dump first thing Monday morning. Then he clapped me on the shoulder and said something about moving forward, about fresh starts, and he smelled of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of whatever financial instrument he was already orchestrating. I waited until they left for a late lunch at a wine bar with potential clients, a lunch Diane had mentioned 3 times that morning as if it were a state dinner. The bag was still in the garage, beneath a stack of flattened moving boxes and a rolled-up rug that smelled of mothballs. I cut the plastic open with a box cutter from Dad's workbench, retrieved the cigar box, and carried it into the guest bathroom, the only room in the house where the door locked from the inside. I sat on the edge of the clawfoot tub, the box on my lap, and I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting Martin to burst through the door and demand I hand it over. Inside I found 7 Maxell UR 60-minute cassette tapes, the ones with the grey labels and the little write-on strips, all of them blank except one that had a date scrawled in my father's wobbly but unmistakable architectural handwriting, 02/14, which was Valentine's Day, 1 month before he died. The ink was slightly smeared, as if his hand had dragged across the label before it dried. Beneath the tapes rested the notebook, a 4x6-inch spiral with a marbled green cover and pages made of that thin graph paper engineers favor, the kind with pale blue grid lines that are almost invisible unless you tilt the page to the light. I opened it. The first 30 pages were filled with notes about jazz records, catalog numbers, pressing plant identifiers, and meticulous condition grades, all in Dad's hand. He used a mechanical pencil with a 0.5 lead, the kind he sharpened obsessively with a tiny brass sharpener he kept in his shirt pocket. The entries read like a forensic inventory. BLP 1501, Miles Davis Val. 1 Deep Groove West 63rd VG++ vinyl, sleeve NM slight ring wear, RVG ear in dead wax. I flipped to the last page expecting nothing and found 3 lines written in blue ink, the letters slightly tremulous, the pressure of the pen varying as if he had stopped and started several times. It said, "The records are Lily's. Martin will try to steal them. Do not trust him, save yourself." The word save was underlined twice, so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when it counts. Dad's Blue Note collection was legendary among a very specific subset of audiophiles, the kind of people who could argue for 3 hours about the sonic difference between a plastilite P and A ear in the dead wax without ever raising their voices. He had started buying the records new in the late 1950s, back when you could walk into a 5 and dime and pick up a first pressing of John Coltrane's Blue Train for $3.49. Over 6 decades he assembled a complete run of every Blue Note release from 1955 to 1965, the golden era, the stuff that modern collectors call the Holy Grail catalog. Original deep groove mono pressings, the ones with the West 63rd Street address on the label, and the ear that meant the stamper came from Ruddy Van Gelder's Inglewood Cliffs studio. 312 records, each one sleeved in a polyethylene archival inner, and housed in a custom-built cabinet. He had designed himself with humidity control, a seismic isolation base, and a glass door that sealed with a rubber gasket, because apparently a structural engineer couldn't just listen to music. He had to engineer the entire listening experience. The collection had been professionally appraised 3 years before his death at $220,000, a figure I knew because I was the one who drove him to the appraisal office and waited in the car for 2 hours while he argued with the appraiser about the true value of a near-mint 1958 Cannonball Adderley something else. That record alone, I learned that day, could buy a decent used car, and Dad had 2 copies, 1 mono and 1 stereo, because he insisted the mono had better mid-range presence. The Thursday after the funeral, Martin and Diane sat me down at their kitchen island, a 10-foot slab of white quartz that Diane wiped down constantly with a microfiber cloth, as if fingerprints were a moral failing. The island had 5 bar stools upholstered in grey linen, and they placed me on the one at the end, like a witness in a deposition. Martin explained that as executor he had a fiduciary duty to liquidate the estate's assets to cover outstanding debts and distribute the residue. He slid a document across the island, a power of attorney form that would grant him full control over my portion of the inheritance, and told me it was standard procedure, just a signature to keep things moving, nothing to worry about. He would handle all the paperwork, and I could focus on healing. The form was 3 pages long, the font small enough that a grieving person would never read it. I caught the phrase full and irrevocable authority over all tangible and intangible personal property before I forced my eyes to glaze. Diane added that they had already arranged for me to stay in their guest house while I processed the loss, a gesture so generous it almost sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced it in front of a mirror. She said, "We want you close, Lily. You've been so isolated out here with Dad. You need family now." The word family landed like a counterfeit bill, flat and weightless. I played the part. I let my shoulders slump, let my voice crack, told them I could barely remember my own phone number these days, and that paperwork made my head spin, that I hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since Dad passed, and the thought of making any decisions right now felt like trying to solve a crossword puzzle underwater. I signed nothing. I said I needed a few weeks to get my bearings, that my grief counselor recommended no major life changes for at least 60 days. The grief counselor was a lie, but I said it with such trembling conviction that Diane nodded sympathetically and said, of course, we completely understand." Martin's jaw tightened, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, a tiny spasm of the masseter muscle you would miss if you were not watching for it, and then the plastidon compassion returned. "Of course, Lily, take all the time you need. We'll revisit next month." He slid the power of attorney form back into his leather folio, and I noticed his hand was shaking slightly, the way a gambler's hand shakes when the roulette wheel slows down. I moved into the guest house on a Saturday, a detached studio with a kitchenette and a sliding glass door that opened onto a patch of gravel they called a courtyard. The unit was comfortable but not private, decorated in what Diane called transitional coastal, which meant beige everything with occasional blue throw pillows. Diane had a habit of dropping by unannounced with leftover quinoa salad in a glass container she would later retrieve. "Checking the recycling bin to see if I was drinking too much," she said, "but really just cataloguing my consumption." Martin stopped in every evening around 7, ostensibly to check on me but really to probe for updates on my mental state and whether I had given any thought to signing the papers. He would lean against the kitchenette counter and talk about estate logistics the way you talk about the weather, casual and inevitable, and every time I told him I was still foggy, still processing, he would nod gravely and say he understood, but the next night he would be back with the same questions phrased slightly differently, a salesman testing different approaches on a reluctant customer. I let them believe I was broken, a foggy-headed woman still reeling from a decade of caregiving, incapable of reading a legal document or recognizing manipulation when she saw it. I wore the same grey cardigan for 3 days straight. I left unwashed dishes in the sink, and I stared out the window for hours, the picture of functional collapse. In truth, the moment I read those 3 lines in my father's notebook, something had snapped awake inside me, a cold, precise machinery of attention that I had not felt since my library days, when I spent my afternoons cataloguing medieval manuscript fragments and could spot a forged marginalia from across the room. I began to watch. The guest house was separated from the main house by a shared wall and a thin door that led into the laundry room, a narrow space with a stacked washer-dryer unit and a vinyl floor that amplified every sound from the kitchen beyond. If I sat on the floor next to the dryer, my back against the cold metal, I could hear conversations in the kitchen as clearly as if I was standing at the island. I learned Diane's schedule. She left every morning at 9:15 after an espresso and a 20-minute Instagram scroll, and she returned around 4 unless she had a showing. Martin worked from a home office, but he took lunch meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he had a golf game every Saturday morning. Over the next 2 weeks I pieced together a mosaic of evidence, every piece sliding into place like a jigsaw puzzle where the picture was a crime scene. Martin took a call from a man he called Dr. Ellison, the head of special collections at a large Midwestern university, and discussed shipping logistics for a major acquisition of vintage jazz media. He used the word acquisition, not donation, and he mentioned climate-controlled freight and insurance riders and a delivery window of 10 to 14 days. A day later, Diane stood at the island and fielded 3 increasingly frantic calls from the same university's development office, each one ending with her saying the records are in escrow, the sale is pending probate clearance, just have the check ready, it's a formality. Her voice was honeyed on the first call, clipped on the second, and outright sharp on the third, and I heard her slam her phone down and mutter something about academic bureaucrats who couldn't close a door. Meanwhile, a new car appeared in their driveway, a silver Lexus SUV with a giant red bow on the hood, the sort of vehicle you buy when you are absolutely certain that a $280,000 windfall is already wired to your account. Martin posed for a photo next to it, holding the keys like a trophy, and Diane posted the photo on Facebook with the caption, "Hard work pays off," and 300 likes from people who didn't know the hard work was fraud. Martin also began a backyard renovation, tearing out a perfectly functional concrete patio to install a fire feature, a built-in pizza oven, and a seeding wall faced in split-face travertine. The construction crew arrived at 7 every morning with jackhammers and a bobcat, and the noise rattled the guest house windows. Diane ordered new living room furniture that arrived in crates, stamped with the name of an Italian design house I had only ever seen in architecture magazines. A sectional the color of oatmeal and a coffee table that looked like a slab of polished concrete, but cost more than my first car. I watched them spend money they did not yet have with the swagger of people who believed the system would never catch up, and I catalogued every purchase in a small notebook of my own, the same kind of graph paper spiral Dad had used, because I have always believed that documentation is a form of self-defense. What I needed was physical proof of the scheme, something with a signature or a notary stamp that I could show a judge. I found it 10 days into my stay, on a Tuesday morning when the backyard crew was on a coffee break, and the house had gone quiet for the first time in hours. Martin had an old cross-cut paper shredder in his home office, a mid-tier fellows model that made a grinding noise like a garbage disposal when it jammed. I heard that noise through the laundry room door, followed by Martin cursing and yanking the bin out. He stormed out of the office a moment later, already late for a lunch meeting, and left a confetti of cross-cut strips scattered across his desk, the shredder bin half full and the mouth of the feeder still clogged with a crumpled sheet he had tried to force through too quickly. I happened to wander in a few minutes later to borrow a roll of packing tape from his supply closet, and I saw the mess. The strips were the size of confetti, about 1/8 of an inch wide and an inch long, and they lay in drifts across the desk like industrial snowfall. A normal person might have swept the shreds into the trash and moved on, or at most scooped them into a Ziploc bag for later. I was not a normal person. I was a woman who had spent 15 years reassembling fragments, who had once reconstructed a shredded medieval antiphonary for a museum exhibit using nothing but archival tape, a magnifying lamp, and a forensic knowledge of parchment grain. I also knew that cross-cut shredders were designed to destroy documents visually but not logically, because most people lacked the patience to reassemble them. I had that patience. I gathered every strip I could see, including the ones that had fallen onto the floor and beneath the desk and into the shredder bin itself, and I carried them in a folded dish towel back to the guest house, walking carefully so the confetti wouldn't spill. I spread the strips across the kitchen counter under a magnifying desk lamp I had brought from Dad's study, the same lamp he used to inspect record grooves for hairline cracks. I sorted them by edge pattern, by paper color, and by the tiny fragments of printed text that aligned across adjacent strips. Reassembling cross-cut shredded documents is a meditative nightmare, a task that requires you to hold 100 tiny variables in your head at once while resisting the urge to sweep the whole mess onto the floor and scream. I had coffee, a part of it black and bitter, and I had a bone-deep hatred that kept my fingers steady. After 90 minutes I had the top third of a document. After 2 hours I had the middle. The bottom took another 40 because the paper had been folded before shredding, creating diagonal cuts that didn't align cleanly. When I finished, I pressed the pieces between 2 sheets of clear contact paper, a trick I knew from book conservation, and held the document up to the light. It was a bill of sale, typed on a law firm's letterhead, the firm name at the top still partially legible as Murchison & Lowe, attorneys at law. The body of the document purported to transfer ownership of the Blue Note collection, described as 312 vinyl jazz recordings catalogued per the appended inventory. From Lily T. Brennan to Dr. Leonard Ellison, acting on behalf of the university's Rare Music Archive, for the sum of exactly $1. Beneath the typed text, 2 signature lines. One was signed in a heavy black ink, a florid hand I recognized as my brother's, the M of Martin looping extravagantly. The second was my name, spelled correctly, but the L looped in a way I have never written an L in my life, and the Bren of Brennan trailed off in a tremble that someone had tried to steady by going over the line twice. The forger had pressed too hard on the second pass, creating a slight double image that was visible even through the contact paper. I had a forgery. I now had motive, means, and a fraudulent instrument. What I did not yet have was an unimpeachable voice of truth. The filing cabinet in Martin's office was a 2-drawer vertical unit with a tubular key lock, the kind you can buy at any office supply store for $60, and that a determined amateur can open with a Bic pen and 30 seconds of patience, or in my case, a straightened paper clip and a hollowed-out pen cap. I learned lockpicking from my father when I was 12 years old, not as a criminal skill, but as part of his general philosophy that a person should understand how mechanical systems work, especially when those systems fail. He was a structural engineer who spent his weekends repairing the neighbors' sump pumps and rekeying their deadbolts, And he taught me that a tubular lock is just a series of pin stacks waiting to be aligned. You insert the paperclip as a tension wrench, apply gentle rotational pressure, and then use the hollowed pen cap to press each pin stack individually until you feel a slight give, a tiny click that means the driver pin has cleared the shear line. It took me 4 attempts on a practice lock Dad had given me when I was 13, but by the time I was 15, I could open a typical filing cabinet lock in under a minute. I waited until a Saturday when Martin and Diane left for a 3-hour open house in a neighboring county, an event Diane had been promoting on Instagram all week with hashtags like #luxuryliving and #dreamhomegoals, which meant I had a guaranteed window of at least 2.5 hours. I slipped into the office with my tools, the paperclip pre-bent to a 90-degree angle, and the pen cap cut to a short tube with a slight bevel on the lip. The lock surrendered on the 3rd attempt, the plug rotating with a satisfying snick. Inside the top drawer, behind hanging file folders labeled with the names of Martin's commercial properties, I found a folder labeled Brennan Estate, a red tab on the edge, the kind of tab that screamed "Look here." Inside the folder was the original last will and testament of my father, dated 6 years earlier, a multi-page document on heavy bond paper with notary seals and witness signatures. Attached by a paperclip was a codicil added after his appraisal 3 years ago, a single page that explicitly bequeathed the Blue Note collection to me, Lily Teresa Brennan, free and clear of any estate debt, along with a notarized inventory of every record, sleeve condition, and catalog number. The inventory ran 23 pages, every entry in Dad's handwriting, and it included a note at the bottom of the final page. The collection is separately insured under a scheduled personal property rider, policy number BP 7742LR, effective 03/2019. Stapled to the back of the will was a photocopy of the same $1 bill of sale I had just pieced together from the shredder confetti. Martin had not bothered to destroy the original will because he needed it to prove his executorship, but he had shredded the bill of sale after making a photocopy, planning to produce the copy when needed and destroy the original, which was exactly the kind of half-clever, half-stupid plan that sounded good in a real estate broker's head, but collapsed under any real scrutiny. He had filed the original somewhere else, probably with the university, and the photocopy was just a placeholder. At the very back of the drawer, beneath a stack of tax returns held together by a rusty binder clip, I found the cassette tape. It was the same Maxell UR60 I had seen in the cigar box, dated 02/14, and it had been removed from the box before they threw it away. Martin must have found the box earlier and pulled the one tape he thought might contain something damaging, but he had never listened to it. If he had, he would have destroyed it immediately, thrown it into a fire or crushed it under his heel or run a magnet over it until the magnetic particles screamed. I knew he had never listened because the tape was still fully wound, the pressure pad intact, the little felt strip clean and unfrayed. I carried it back to the guest house with the same carefulness a bomb disposal tech carries a live device, and I locked the door behind me. I dug my old Sony Walkman out of a storage bin in the closet, a WMFX 290 I had kept for digitizing old family recordings, its silver plastic casing scratched but functional. I inserted 2 AA batteries, plugged in my headphones, and pressed play. My father's voice came through the headphones, thin and reedy from the oxygen tubes he had worn that last month, the nasal cannula hissing faintly in the background, but clear enough to break my heart all over again. He said, "Lily, this is February 14th. I'm recording this because my lawyer says a verbal statement won't hold up, but an audio recording with a date stamp can establish contemporaneous intent, whatever that means. The Blue Note records are yours, all 312 of them. I have known since your mother died that Martin resents you for taking care of me, and I have seen him looking at the collection the way a real estate developer looks at a condemned building. He thinks it's his inheritance too, but it's not. It is a thank you, Lily, for 15 years of breakfasts and medication schedules and driving me to dialysis at 5 in the morning. Your brother wouldn't even drive me to the grocery store. I asked him once 3 years ago to take me to an audiologist appointment, and he said he had a closing that day, a closing that he later admitted was just a lunch with a lender. I know he is going to try to sell the records the moment I am gone, so I have filed a notarized statement with my attorney, attached to the will, and the collection is separately catalogued and insured under your name as a scheduled personal property rider on my homeowner's policy. It cannot be sold without your explicit signature. Do not sign anything, do not trust him. I love you. This is Miles, by the way, on Kind of Blue, track 1. In the background I heard the opening trumpet notes of So What, The very same album I had played in the hospice room, the bass and piano comping softly under Dad's words. He had recorded this message exactly 1 month before he died, while listening to the record that started his entire jazz obsession in 1959, the year he bought his first Blue Note and never looked back. I sat on the floor of the guest house with my back against the bed frame and let myself cry for 3 minutes, great heaving sobs that I muffled with my sleeve so no one would hear through the wall. Then I stood up, dried my face on a dish towel, and started planning exactly how I was going to bury my brother under the weight of his own greed. My father's attorney was a woman named Ruth Halpern, a probate specialist in her late 60s, who had handled his estate planning for 3 decades, ever since my parents bought their first house in 1982. I remembered her from childhood as a tall woman with a loud laugh and a handshake that left your knuckles sore, and she had been the one to draft my father's will after Mom died. I called her from a payphone at a gas station 2 miles away because I was not stupid enough to use my cell phone inside Martin's Wi-Fi network, which Diane boasted was a mesh system with enterprise-grade security that probably logged every packet. The payphone was one of the last working ones in the county, a battered silver shell outside a Shell station on Route 9, and I fed it quarters from a roll I had bought at a grocery store specifically for this call. Ruth answered on the 3rd ring, and when I said my name she didn't ask why I was calling from a strange number, didn't express surprise, just said, "Lily, I was wondering when you'd call. Your father told me to expect you." She told me he had called her office 2 weeks before he died, the same day he recorded the cassette, and he had instructed her to lock down the collection in a way that even an executor couldn't undo. Ruth confirmed that the notarized inventory catalog was already lodged with the county probate court, that my father had insisted on a dead man's switch clause that froze the collection's transfer until I personally appeared in front of a court clerk to acknowledge the bequest, and that the $1 bill of sale would collapse instantly under a handwriting analysis because my signature was on file from decades of bank documents and old library employment contracts she could summon in under an hour. She also told me the university had already wired a deposit of $140,000 to an escrow account set up by Martin at a regional bank, and that the balance of another $140,000 would be released upon probate clearance, which Martin had been pressuring the court to expedite with a series of increasingly frantic motions. She said she could file an emergency motion to halt the sale and alert the university's legal department, but she needed me to bring the original shredded document, the cassette, and a sworn affidavit detailing everything I had witnessed. I said I would have them in her office by Monday morning, but first I needed one more piece of the puzzle, something that would make any remaining family loyalty evaporate like steam off a parking lot in July. I staged a collapse. On Sunday evening, after a day of watching Martin pace the kitchen on his phone with a lender who was apparently questioning the escrow timeline, I walked into the main house through the laundry room door, called out for Diane in a voice just weak enough to sound distressed, and then let my legs buckle in the hallway near the kitchen. I fell heavily, knocking over a small console table that held a ceramic vase, the vase shattering on the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot. I lay on the floor amidst the shards, my eyes half closed, my breath shallow and ragged, my lips parted. I had practiced the collapse in front of a mirror 3 times, so I knew how to crumple without breaking anything, how to let my head loll to the side so I looked unconscious but could still see through my eyelashes. From my position I could see into the living room where Martin was seated at a desk piled with estate paperwork, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up at the noise, saw me on the floor and paused. He did not move toward me. He did not call my name. He did not reach for his phone to dial 911. He stood slowly, his chair scraping back, and walked deliberately around my sprawled body, stepping over the broken vase, and retrieved a document from the kitchen island, a manila folder with a university crest on it. He returned to his desk, sat down and continued reading, turning pages with a calm that was more terrifying than anger would have been. Diane appeared in the hallway a moment later, her heels clicking, saw me and said, "Is she okay?" Without any urgency whatsoever, the same tone she used to ask if the gardener had trimmed the hedges. Martin didn't look up. "She's breathing," he said. "Give her a minute, these escrow amendments need to go out tonight." I lay there for another 30 seconds while the two of them discussed whether the fire feature should be propane or natural gas, the heat output of each, the resale value implications, the lead time on the stonework. Then I stirred, groaned, and pulled myself to a sitting position, a shard of ceramic digging into my palm. Diane helped me to my feet, her hands perfunctory and cold, her nails immaculate, and told me I must have been dehydrated, that grief does strange things to the body, that I should drink more water. I apologized for the fuss, for the vase, for the inconvenience, and limped back to the guest house with a piece of broken ceramic still clutched in my hand like a relic. That was the moment I knew they would have let me die on that floor if it meant the probate clearance moved forward without a hitch. I felt nothing, not anger, not grief, just a cold, crystalline clarity that spread through my chest like ice forming on a still pond. Monday morning I dressed in a navy blazer I had kept pressed for the last 15 years, the one I wore to job interviews I never attended, and I looked at myself in the guest house bathroom mirror. My hair was grey at the temples, my face lined in ways I hadn't noticed before, but my eyes were clear and steady, the eyes of a woman who had just been given permission to stop being a victim. I slipped the cassette, the pieced-together bill of sale sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve, and a thumb drive containing photos of the forged signature next to a sample of my actual handwriting into an old leather satchel I had used in graduate school, and I walked out to my car, a 15-year-old Honda that still smelled slightly of Dad's oxygen tank. I drove 20 minutes to downtown, parked in a municipal lot, and walked into Ruth Halpin's office on the 4th floor of a brick building that had housed law firms since the 1920s. The office smelled of old paper and coffee, and Ruth was exactly as I remembered her. Tall, silver-haired, a woman who wore reading glasses on a chain, and had a framed photograph of her late husband on her desk, next to a row of Black's Law dictionaries. She listened to the cassette in its entirety, her expression unchanging, and when the Miles Davis trumpet began to play she removed her glasses and polished them with a small cloth she kept in her desk drawer. "Your father was a smart man," she said. "This plus the notarized inventory plus the insurance rider gives us a solid case, but we need to act fast. Martin has an expedited hearing request pending for Wednesday morning. He thinks it's a formality." Ruth assembled a package of evidence in under 2 hours, scanning every document, recording a certified copy of the cassette onto a digital dictaphone, and she filed an emergency motion to intervene with the probate court judge that same afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier. She also placed a call to the university's general counsel, a man named Weatherby who had no idea he was about to become an accessory to fraud. She explained in her calm, iron voice that the collection his institution had purchased was the subject of a fraudulent conveyance, that a forged bill of sale had been submitted to the escrow agent, and that accepting delivery would expose the university to a civil suit for conversion and a public relations catastrophe. Rare Music Archive buys stolen jazz collection from forger. The headlines would read, and the university's donor base, which included several prominent jazz philanthropists, would not be amused. Weatherby said he would freeze the escrow fund immediately and demand a full accounting from Martin within 48 hours. The confrontation happened 3 days later, on a Wednesday morning so bright and clear it felt like a mockery. Martin believed the probate hearing would be a formality, a final signature to release the funds and make his $280,000 payday official. He had dressed for the occasion in a charcoal suit and a tie the color of money, and Diane had worn a pearl necklace that cost more than Dad's entire collection of Art Blakey first pressings. He drove me to the courthouse himself, Diane in the back seat, and the whole way there he briefed me on what to say to the clerk, his voice genial and patient, as if he were explaining a mortgage to a first-time homebuyer. "Just sign where they tell you to sign, Lily. This is the last step, and then we can all move on. The estate will be settled, the house will be sold, and you'll have a nice little cushion to start over. I've got an offer on the house already, by the way, a cash offer from a developer, so this is really the final piece." I sat in the passenger seat with my satchel on my lap and said nothing, watching the morning light stutter through the trees. We parked in the courthouse garage, walked up the broad stone steps, and entered the probate clerk's office, a fluorescent-lit room with linoleum floors and a countertop thick enough to stop bullets, the kind of institutional space where lives are quietly reorganized every day. Ruth was already there, standing near the counter in a black suit, her leather briefcase open on a chair. I saw the moment Martin registered her presence because his steps faltered, and his head swiveled toward me with a question he didn't have time to ask. Standing behind Ruth were a county fraud investigator, Detective Holloway, a man in his 50s with a grey mustache and a badge clipped to his belt, and a uniformed sheriff's deputy, his hand resting lightly on his duty weapon. The colour drained from Martin's face in stages, like a photograph developing in reverse from false confidence to sickly white. The probate clerk, a woman with bifocals and an expression of terminal patience, asked Martin to present the $1 bill of sale for authentication as part of the estate inventory verification. He produced the original from his leather folio, the signature forgery gleaming in black ink, and laid it on the counter with a flourish that was meant to look casual. I stepped forward and placed my own documents on the counter beside it, the shredded reconstruction sealed in contact paper, the notarized will and codicil, the inventory. Ruth handed the clerk a portable tape player and requested the recording be entered into the record. My father's voice filled the room, scratchy but undeniable, listing the records, naming me, condemning his son, and the faint trumpet of Miles Davis lifted behind his words like a ghost. The clerk adjusted her bifocals and looked at the bill of sale, then at my driver's license, then at Martin. Detective Holloway picked up the bill of sale, held it next to a handwriting exemplar I had provided from my cancelled checks, and told Martin very quietly that a forensic document examiner was already en route from the state crime lab and that the initial visual comparison was not looking good for him. Martin's mouth opened and closed, a fish drowning in air. Diane's composure, which had been a pressed linen facade, shattered into a high-pitched demand for a lawyer, her voice bouncing off the tile walls. I looked at my brother, and for the first time in my life I felt no need to explain, no urge to defend, no weight of family obligation pressing on my chest. I said very quietly so that only he could hear, "You wanted the records, Martin, but you'll only ever get the static. The static of a dead tape, the hiss of a blank shelf, the silence that follows a con man's last lie." The deputy stepped forward, read Martin his rights in a monotone that must have been the 1,000th time he had spoken those words, and cuffled him in front of a small audience of clerks and filing attorneys who had stopped their work to watch. Diane fled the building, her heels clicking down the hallway like a telegraph tapping out defeat, and her pearl necklace broke, scattering a line of beads across the linoleum that no one bothered to pick up. The aftermath took longer than the setup, because legal processes grind slowly, but the consequences were absolute, and, I will admit, deeply satisfying. The bill of sale was ruled a forgery by the forensic document examiner, who testified that the signature was a clumsy simulation, exhibiting, patching, retouching and tremor consistent with an attempt to trace or copy. The sale to the university was voided ab initio, a Latin term I had learned in my library days, meaning it was treated as if it had never happened. The escrow fund was returned to the university, and the entire Blue Note collection was returned to me in 12 archival boxes delivered by an armored courier service, each box marked property of Lily T. Brennan in bold black letters, the same boxes Dad had stored them in, with his handwritten label on the side. Blue Note 1500 Series Alp. I opened the first box, pulled out a first pressing of Horace Silver's song from my father, and held it in my hands like a holy relic. Martin's criminal case moved swiftly because the evidence was overwhelming. He pleaded no contest to fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation, a charge that had been added because the prosecutor argued that Dad's estate qualified as an elder asset. His defense attorney, a man whose retainer had been paid with the Lexus's trade-in, negotiated a deal built around restitution rather than prison time. Martin received 5 years of supervised probation, 18 months of house arrest with an ankle monitor, and a civil judgment requiring him to liquidate every asset he owned. The Lexus was repossessed by the dealership with 3 missed payments already on its record. The backyard renovation was abandoned in a crater of broken concrete and exposed rebar, the pizza oven never built, the travertine wall stacked in pallets that rotted under a tarp for 2 years. The Italian furniture was seized by the sheriff's department and auctioned for a fraction of its purchase price. Diane filed for divorce 6 weeks after Martin's arrest, citing irreconcilable differences and a strategic interest in salvaging her real estate license, which had been suspended pending an ethics review after the fraud became public, in a local news article titled, "Real Estate Agent Husband Forged Sister's Signature to Sell Rare Jazz Collection." When the dust settled, Martin was left with a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex near the interstate, a decade of garnished wages, and a criminal record that made him unemployable in any industry that conducted background checks, which in commercial real estate is all of them. I used the restitution funds and the collection's insurance payout, which Ruth negotiated from the insurer despite the attempted fraud because the policy was in my name, to open a shop downtown, a narrow storefront with exposed brick walls, original tin ceilings, and vintage listening stations I found at an estate sale in Philadelphia. I named it Vinyl Vendetta Records. Every single record sleeve in the store carries a small printed insert, a reproduction of the probate court's fraud docket, listing the case number, the forged document, and the final judgment, printed on archival paper that will last longer than my brother's memory of ever being trusted. Customers sometimes ask about it, and I tell them it's a certificate of authenticity, which it is, just not the kind they expect. My brother works there now, not because I offered him a job out of mercy, but because the terms of his probation required steady employment, and no one else would hire a convicted forger with an ankle monitor and a public record that pops up on the first page of a Google search. I put him on record cleaning duty in the back room, a windowless space with a deep sink and shelves of cleaning solution, and I gave him a uniform. The shirt is charcoal grey with white lettering. On the front, over the left chest, it says Scratched Lies. On the back, in larger print, it says Ask me about my fraud conviction. He polishes the shelving units and fills the cleaning baths with enzymatic fluid, and every time a new customer walks through the door I watch his eyes drop to the floor. He has never once complained. I think he knows that if he complains, I will simply point to the door and let his probation officer know he is voluntarily unemployed. I do not feel satisfaction, not exactly, but I feel something close to completion, the quiet hum of a perfectly aligned turntable. My father never got to see his collection hang on those walls, but he knew exactly what he was doing when he scribbled that warning in the back of a graph paper notebook and pressed record on a drugstore cassette tape while Miles Davis played behind him. He left me more than records. He left me a blueprint for self-rescue, a dead man's switch of the soul that activated the moment I refused to sign. The collection is not for sale, by the way. I play a different album every morning when I open the shop, and I let the music fill the space the way he used to fill his study. If you want to hear it, you have to come in and listen. The first track is always So What, and I always think of him. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I hope you handled it with more restraint than I did, but I won't judge you if you didn't. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications if you believe that some inheritances aren't about money, but about the last word, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that a cassette tape and a steady nerve can beat a six-figure lie. If you want to follow along with more stories of people who refuse to be erased, stick around. I'll be here with the records.